All right, there we go. So we are now recording. All right, so thank you for joining me. This is Spirit Songs, Homosexuality and the Bible series, and today we're going to talk about First Timothy and First Corinthians, what we call, or what I call, the naughty lists. We're going to mostly focus, really, just about the whole thing on First Timothy. That's because when you learn about First Timothy and you place it into context, a lot of that spills over to First Corinthians. And you'll see what I mean by that. So we're going to really focus on First Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. So let me go ahead and read to you this passage. And this is one of the clobber passages that people talk about. We also know, let me go ahead and make this bigger for everybody. There we go. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine. So that's the clobber passage. You can see the word right there, homosexuality. And so we're going to investigate First Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. You know, you've seen this before. Many of you have. So just to make sure we're talking about the same things here, homosexuality is a relatively new word. It was coined in the mid 1800s. And so anytime you see it used in our modern translations, you have to understand that that word really wasn't around in ancient Israel, if you're talking about the Old Testament, or in the Greek, if you're talking about the New Testament. And homosexuality comes with baggage, and I think most of you appreciate that, you know, the minute you say homosexual or something like that, or some version of that, you know, many people start thinking about what you do in your own bedroom with somebody else. And it tends to, as you see the third bullet point there, it tends to limit the true meaning of homosexuality, which is really maybe better seen as a lifestyle, not just who you're having sex with. So at SpiritSong Church, we prefer the word orientation. We believe that that is a better word to study here. Orientation, according to medical texts, right, is an innate or intrinsic attraction for one gender, or both genders, or even no genders. There are some people who claim to be asexual, and that's fine. But orientation, the key thing here is that it is a part of you. It's part of your design. It's part of your makeup. And the last bullet point is important for our conversation. Orientation is not behavior. We're not talking about lifestyle here. Orientation is simply the gender you're attracted to, and it's built in. It's not a choice. It's not a preference. Now, behavior, listen, the lifestyle and stuff like that, that's a totally different conversation. We are going to talk today about, you know, or we're going to investigate the claim that many churches use today that same-sex orientation is a sin. And so we're going to be looking at that innate, that intrinsic attraction for one gender. Is that really a sin? And that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at lifestyle and behavior. Again, that's a totally different conversation. And so I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Now, I'm going to play a little game here with you. It turns out, I don't know if you know this, but it's heterosexuality that's the real sin. Yeah. Bet you didn't know that. It comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And that's from the NIV. So there you go. Homosexuality turns out to be the real sin. Of course it's not. Of course, I'm just playing around here, because when you really put 1 Corinthians chapter 7 into context, and you don't just cherry pick out that one verse, you will realize Paul is writing about celibacy versus marriage. Paul, at this point in his ministry, was celibate, and he thought that was the best thing to do. That people, if you were celibate, you could be totally committed to the Lord, and he thought that that was better. And that brings me to the point, you know, context. We have to understand why something was written. We have to understand how something was written. That would be the literary structure. What was the theological purpose? What was the history like? What was the culture like? And then, of course, language. The linguistic context is very important. When you put all this together, this is known as hermeneutics. It's the rules of interpretation. It's a standardized set of rules, really, for interpreting and translating any ancient text. And hopefully the result will be the best possible meaning of the original text. Now, there's a fifth bullet point down there on context called discerning and emotional. That's not really part of hermeneutics, but I just like to bring that up. That I think as growing Christians, as a and I'm making that assumption that most people watching this are believers, and that's why you're here watching this. But as you grow closer to Jesus and your walk with Jesus, the discerning or emotional context, I think, is an important one. It's just the closer you get to Jesus and the more you read his word, you might hear things, and you might say to yourself, wait a second, that doesn't line up with what I know about the love of God, the patience of God, the holiness of God. So that's the discerning and emotional context as well. So at Spirit Song Church, we believe in digging deep and looking at all these different things here, and that's what we're going to do with First Timothy. So First Timothy, just the overall letter, the literary or structural context is that it's prose. Now, prose simply just means he was writing a letter to a young minister named Timothy, and he was just using everyday language. It's not fancy, it's not poetry. It's just he was writing a letter, like you would write a letter to a friend, maybe. I don't know if anybody writes letters anymore, but maybe text an email to a friend. You would use prose, just the everyday language, and that's what it is. He does something interesting here. We're gonna dive deeper into this, and it's called I always have a hard time saying this. Parallelism. Parallelism. And it's a form of it's a literary form that takes something people know, from the past, and brings it forward but using more modern words. And so we'll look at that. And it is believed that Paul was using parallelism in his letter here. The theological or purpose of this was really to refute false teachings or false teachers. And he was writing this to the church in Ephesus. This was just like there's specific letters to the Corinthians. This was a letter written to the church in Ephesus. So, and he was specifically writing this to Timothy, but he was talking about these false things that were going on in the church at Ephesus. The history here, well, you got to know about the city of Ephesus. It was a port city, which means there was a lot of trading going on, a lot of different types of people, cultures, and language coming together. And there were all sorts of different religions that were practiced, but ultimately, being a Greek city, most of the people there were polytheistic, and they did practice and participate in a lot of paganistic rituals. And for those of you that have taken the class on Romans with this, we talked a little bit more about what Paul, as a minister, when he was doing his missionary journeys, when he was going to all these different cities, the things he would witness. And Paul was definitely a direct eyewitness of these polytheistic, paganistic festivals that had all kinds of crazy things going on, homoerotic sex acts in worship of false gods, animal sacrificing, bloodletting. There were all kinds of crazy things, well documented in extra biblical sources outside the Bible. And Paul saw that and was a witness to that. So you have to keep that in mind. And the linguistic context is the Greek language, and we're going to spend a lot of time there today. So First Timothy, what we're going to ultimately look at then, the context of First Timothy chapter 1, is going to be the theological purpose, the linguistic context, and the literary context. So we're going to do it in that order. So first up is the theological, or ultimately, what was the purpose of Paul writing this letter to this young minister named Timothy, and it's from verse 3. So this would be First Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. And right there, this is your introduction. I urged you when I went into Macedonia, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you can command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. So that's the whole point. Paul is writing this letter to a young minister and encouraging him to stay true to the gospel message and and to not teach these false ideas, these false theologies and doctrines that were starting to infiltrate some of these churches. The three main I guess false teachings of this day. There's also a fourth one here that I didn't include, but I'll mention it. Um, you have something that was known as decadent Judaism. That's in this first chapter, verses 4 through 7, and we'll look at some of that. There's also what is known as false asceticism. This is basically like denying your body food for a while or not getting married, whatever it is, and it really wasn't. It was never a part of that original message, the original gospel. And then just in general, Gnosticism was very common in the Greek world. Gnosticism is a belief in that the spirit is more important than the material, than the body. And specifically, the Gnostic doctrine taught that the world was created and ruled by a lesser divinity, and that Christ was an emissary or a representative of the remote supreme divine being, but no real belief that Christ himself was God in the flesh. He was simply like an angel, maybe, or like a representative, if you will. A fourth one here that I didn't put is known as docetism, and that's a belief that Jesus actually wasn't man at all. We do believe that Jesus was God in the flesh, meaning he was man as if not God, and God as if not man. That perfect union. And docetism, which is something that the Apostle John tackles in his letters, was the belief that Jesus was really just God in spirit. He actually didn't have bodily form. Paul, in his letter, initially focuses mostly on what is known as decadent Judaism, and this is verses 4 through 7. And basically, he just lays it out that there were some people teaching these things from Judaism that were more based on myth and allegory and story and poetry. There were teachers in these early churches that loved the genealogies, tracking down someone's family lineage. Paul mentions that a lot of this was just meaningless talk. It actually gets people all riled up, and it moves the message away from the true message of the gospel. And there were some other teachers, Christian teachers, who were actually, they considered themselves teachers of the law, that they wanted to promote some aspects of the law. And that is known as a heresy. It's called a syncretistic heresy. And it's something we see a lot today. Syncretistic heresy, or I should say maybe a syncretistic philosophy, is where somebody will pull beliefs from different systems, a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Judaism, a little bit of Gnosticism, a little bit, of decadent Judaism. They kind of pull the things they like from these different worldviews and beliefs, and they just blend it together in their own way. It is known again as syncretistic heresy. And that's ultimately what a lot of these early Christian teachers were doing, is they believed in some aspect of the gospel, but then they also thought, well, there are some parts of the law we should still follow. Maybe there's some Gnostic beliefs that we can blend in. And that ultimately is what Paul was writing about. Now, what's interesting about these Christian teachers who were playing around with the law, maybe we should follow this part of the law a little bit, maybe do a little bit of this part of the law, that kind of thing. Paul states that this was completely unnecessary as believers, because the law And Paul has written about this in other places like Romans. The law itself can't save you. The law itself cannot make you righteous. That as a true believer, you are righteous by faith, and you believe and trust that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. So we're coming into a new covenant. The law is no longer, and instead we live in a dispensation of grace, not the law anymore. And Paul then, after making that statement that ultimately believers, I mean, if you're starting to blend in the law, why are you doing that? You don't need to do that. We're righteous by faith. Paul then states for whom the law is actually for. And this is the naughty list, verses 9 and 10. And it's where we see the clobber passage about homosexuality. Again, here it is. The law is but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine. So the question then becomes, I mean, ultimately what Paul is saying is believers don't need the law. We are righteous by faith, and we believe that through Jesus, that perfect command of God has been fulfilled. And so when you read this list, that just kind of this naughty list, right? And Paul says, these are the people that the law is for. And then we have this word homosexuality. Number one, we know it wasn't even coined at this point. Paul did not have an inkling of this word homosexuality when this was written. So it was not the word that he wrote. So the question then becomes, when you look at this naughty list, right? The list of things that people do that are ultimately that this is who the law is for. Was Paul referencing same-sex orientation as we know it today, or was he referring to somebody else or to something else? What do we know so far? Paul was writing to Timothy to refute false teachers. We know that there were 3 primary false teachings in and around the city of Ephesus, not just in Ephesus, but in Asia Minor, Macedonia, that kind of area. We know that Paul focused on decadent Judaism in this first chapter, that Paul claims that the law, if you're trying to blend in the law with what you believe, you just don't need that because we're righteous by faith. We're righteous in Christ, not in the law. And then he lays out who he believes the law is for, the naughty list. That's what we know so far. So let's take that understanding and look at the language then. And again, it's Greek language. And here's verse 10. There you can see it again. For the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality. And you can read the rest there. Well, the Greek word that Paul actually wrote is arsenokoitai. So where you see bold-faced homosexuality, the word in the oldest manuscripts that we have, the word there in the Greek is arsenokoitai. Here's the big thing you got to remember. Arsenokoitai is lost in translation in modern day Greek. The average Greek-speaking person today would have no idea what arsenokoitai means. It's just not in the vernacular, in the prose of modern day Greek. Now Paul did use this word. So Paul and his audience understood it back then. So what we need to do is we need to take our mindset and we need to go back to Paul's time. We can't take this word and try to bring it to modern day Greek because it's just that translation's just not there. So we really need to look more at what this word meant in ancient Koine Greek, which is that everyday Greek. Are there other people that wrote and used this word? And how did they use it? That would be very helpful. So just to break it down, arsenokoitai, the first part is arseno or arseno, and it means man. Koitai means coitus, sex. So at if you just put it together, I mean, just the roots of the word, put it together, it means man sex. But that begs the question, right? Well, what is man sex? What does that mean? And again, a modern day Greek person would probably understand it to this point: man sex, mean arsenokoitai, man sex, something like that. Well, what could man sex actually mean? I mean, if we're just open and honest, it could mean homosexuality as we know it today. I don't know. Maybe Paul did mean that. I don't think he did, but it's a possibility. It could also mean homoeroticism and paganistic rituals. That makes a little more sense to me, understanding what Paul witnessed throughout Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, all that area. Lots of paganistic festivals, lots of paganistic rituals, and we know from other scripture, like in Romans, that some of that involved homoeroticism, men with men worshiping false gods. Could man sex just mean male prostitution? Maybe, sure. Could it mean pedophilia in some way? Yep. And then there's also the pederastic. The pederastic is these relationships that older men had with younger boys, and we're gonna go ahead and take a look at that. So at the end of the day, we got this word that Paul used, arsenokoitai. The best we can do today is break it down to man sex, but that doesn't really help us because that could mean all kinds of stuff, right? Man sex. So where do a lot of traditional, fundamental, and unfortunately mostly anti-gay scholars stand with this? Well, this is a paper by Dr. James B. DeYoung. He is a professor of New Testament classes at Western Conservative Baptist Seminary, Portland, Oregon. I don't know Dr. DeYoung at all, but I do know he is well respected. He's not one of the anti-gay scholars that tends to be in the limelight so much, but he is often quoted by other more open anti-gay scholars, if you will. So he's well read, well respected, and often quoted. And this is an introduction to his paper. And I'm sorry, I don't have the year that this was actually written, but it's not too long ago. And in this introduction, though, the reason I wanted to show you this is he brings up a couple of things that right away make me question his whole premise. And the reason I'm using Dr. DeYoung in his introduction is because, again, he's well respected and well quoted. And a lot of other anti-gay scholars will take what he's doing and expand that in their own writing. So there, in my opinion, there's some faulty premises here that other scholars just expand in their own writings. And the first one I wanted to bring out is this word of traditional. You see, Dr. DeYoung and many anti-gay scholars, they believe that the traditional rendering of arsenokoitai is homosexual. And they question other people like myself who believe that that's not the traditional rendering. And it brings up this idea then, if you look over to the right here, what does Dr. DeYoung and other scholars mean by traditional? Because what I think they mean is more modern. They are basically making the assumption that the traditional rendering is homosexual, and I don't believe that that's supported at all. And I'm going to show you why in a moment. So right there, the fact that they hang on to this word traditional really doesn't work for them because they're not going back far enough looking at older and older Bible translations. The second thing is they believe, Dr. DeYoung is a big one, that Paul ultimately derived this word, excuse me, from Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. Don't lie with a man as one does with a woman. They believe it was from that he derived this word arsenokoitai. Of course, I have a big problem with that. I think that a true contextual investigation of Leviticus 18:22 does not support this claim. And if we have a class on Leviticus, go check it out. It's a video you can watch, but I'll just sum of up. We believe that Leviticus 18:22 is ultimately talking about idolatry. And don't lie with a man is basically saying don't lie with these priests of these false gods, the Kadesh, these temple court prostitutes. So right here in his introduction, I already have two major issues. One with this idea of the traditional rendering, and number two, I believe is a faulty translation of Leviticus 18:22 by these scholars. Here's another book or letter, or I should say report. This one was written by Perry Kay. It's on these words, Malachi and arsenokoitai. We're going to focus on arsenokoitai. The reason I'm showing you this is this person, Perry Kay, from the West Star Institute National Spring Meeting, which was an actual conference on these clobber passages. And he writes his report using the work of Robin Scroggs, and I underlined it here. Robin Scroggs wrote what is probably the most read and debated book on arsenokoitai than ever published. And that book is called The New Testament and Homosexuality, published in 1983. Robin Scroggs was a prolific writer. He was a biblical historian and theologian. He earned degrees at the Chicago Theological Seminary and Union Seminary in New York. And as I said, his book on the New Testament and homosexuality was widely reviewed by hundreds of scholars from many disciplines. And I wanted to share with you what Dr. Scroggs says are the four common older man, younger boy relationships seen in the Greco-Roman world. And this is important because, again, we have to get into the mind of Paul, right? We can't pull Paul to the year 2020. We need to go to his time. And what were the type of relationships? What were the types of if I will, homosexual relationships that Paul saw and that he was a witness of? And that's why this is important. Robin Scroggs lays out, based on good history, lots of different sources, what were those four common relationships. These are what some people call the pederastic relationships. The first type, and again, excuse me, the first type is, and I want to remind you again that these are relationships that Paul would have witnessed. One was an older male provided a younger male with skills or education. That's the first type. There may have been some sex involved, but the skills and education provided were provided regardless. The sex was not a form of payment, if you will. The second one, and you can actually see to the left here, this is the actual paper, and I've just broken it up where you find these different types of relationships. The second one was much more sexual oriented, right? This is where there was lots of sex probably happening between the older guy and the younger man or boy. And maybe some skills were provided, maybe as like a payment or something. There was also slave prostitution, where the master would actually have sex with the boys. And often, it's kind of sad, if you read more about this, they did that in front of the families and parents to establish complete dominance, if you will, over the slaves. And then number 4 is what is referred to as the effeminate call boys. So Paul would have seen this. These were younger boys, teenage boys who thinner, more in a feminine body type, if you will, thinner, no real hair. So it was kind of almost female-like, if you will, and that's why they were called effeminate cowboys. And the thought was, if I could look more like a woman or a girl, it would put at ease the man who's hiring me for sex. It would make him feel better, something like that. So they were known as effeminate cowboys. Now, please note, this list does not include the homoerotic acts that we saw Paul witnessing in the paganistic festivals. Okay, so there's 5 relationships, same gender relationships that Paul probably witnessed. Older male, younger male for skills and education. Older male, younger male, where it was more sex versus the skills and education. Slave prostitution and effeminate cowboys, and then the homoerotic acts that were happening during paganistic rituals. Those are the same sex relationships that Paul witnessed. So we're going back to his time. So where does that leave us then with this word arsenokoitai? Knowing what Paul would have witnessed? Well, here's a breakdown of how this word has been translated differently over time. And this is where I have a problem with the scholars like Dr. DeYoung talking about the traditional rendering. I actually believe that the more traditional rendering you will find in these earlier translations. So if you look at this very first one up here. So Paul wrote the word arsenokoitai. Ultimately, we don't know what it means. Man sex at best. Well, the Latin Vulgate, which was a translation of Greek to Latin, happened a long, long time ago, 383 AD. They called it masculorum concubidores, or concubitores. Basically means male concubines. Basically means male prostitutes. That's how the Latin Vulgate translators translated arsenokoitai. Basically prostitution. That is a much more traditional rendering, because look how long ago it was. King James, right? Everybody knows King James Version, 1611. They translated arsenokoitai as whoremongers. Whoremongers. Doesn't sound like same-sex orientation relationships we see today, right? As far as I'm pretty sure, you can be a whoremonger, gay or straight. Whoremonger is not about a specific orientation for sure, or even specific gender, right? The American Standard Version in 1901, so we're coming way ahead now, they translated arsenokoitai as fornicators. Now look at what happens in the more recent modern translations. New American Standard in 1971, the NIV, 1978, the New Living Translation, 1996. All of those more modern translations took arsenokoitai and turned it into homosexual. It's almost like what happened in the 1970s, right? You have these much more traditional early translations really using words like whore, concubines, fornicators, prostitutes, stuff like that. But then for some reason, 50s and the 60s, things started to change. And then you get the translations to the word homosexual. By the way, arsenokoitai is based on what we have found in history and archaeology. Arsenokoitai is only used 56 times throughout ancient Greek. Yeah, so this word arsenokoitai that Paul uses was not used very often in ancient texts. And I'm just showing you the first 6 that's listed from a site called Gay Christian 101. You can go through all 56 historical uses. And at the end of the day, either number one, we don't have a definition of the meaning. Paul really doesn't define it because his audience knew what it meant. He didn't have to define it. Sibylline Oracle, the Epistle of Ignatius, the Epistle of Polycarp, all of these writers didn't give a definition of arsenokoitai because their audience knew what it meant. There is one called the Acts of John, and in that chapter, the chapter 36, the author of Acts John, which is a non-canonical book, translates arsenokoitai as the sodomite, and that probably is linked more towards shrine prostitution, the ancient Kadesh, the temple cult prostitutes. If you move it forward a little bit, sodomite may represent the way the people in Sodom were living, which was they were inhospitable, which is the real meaning of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So what do we now know? What do we know so far? Again, Paul was writing to Timothy to refute false teachers. There were three primary false teachings at that time. Paul focused in this first chapter on decadent Judaism. Paul claimed that the law is not for believers, because remember, decadent Judaism was pulling some of the law and combining it with the faith in Jesus Christ. And Paul was like, you don't need that, because through Jesus we are made righteous, not by the law. And then Paul says, if you want to know who the law is actually for, he lays out this naughty list, and that's where we get the modern translation in verse 10 of homosexual. But now we know that that word was actually arsenokoitai, which ultimately is lost in modern Greek language, but based on more traditional, really, really early renderings, it most likely means male prostitutes, whoremongers, fornicators, maybe even some scholars believe pedophiles. The last context I want to share with you is really cool. This is the literary context, and this is the parallelism that Paul was using when he wrote 1 Timothy chapter 1. What you see on the left is the last commandments, numbers 5 through 10 from Exodus 20, verses 12 through 17. What you see on the right is the naughty list that Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 1. What's really interesting, now you got to remember, Paul was a Jew before he was Paul, he was Saul. He was Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, as he said. So Paul knew the commandments, right? He was very familiar with them. So there you see the commandments on the left: honor your mom and dad, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, and don't covet. And then on the right, Paul writes the naughty list from 1 Timothy 1. And what's really interesting is they actually connect. Honor your father and mother. And then what does Paul write? For those who kill their fathers or mothers. Don't murder. Paul writes, for murderers. You shall not commit adultery. This is where Paul wrote the word arsenokoitai. So he's connecting adultery to arsenokoitai. Don't steal. Slave traders. Slave traders steal people's lives. Don't give false testimony. Don't be a liar. Don't perjure. At the end of the day, what's really interesting is if you follow the parallelism, Paul is lining up, you shall not commit adultery, with the sexually immoral, with the arsenokoitai. So based on that, here's what we now know. Again, Paul writing to refute false teachers. We had those three primary false teachings going on. Paul focusing on the decadent Judaism, which was trying to combine some of the faith in Christ with the law. Paul says you don't need that. The law is not for believers because we're made righteous in Jesus. And Paul claims, if you really want to know who the law is for, here's my naughty list. In there in verse 10, he writes the word arsenokoitai, which based on ancient renderings of that word is closer to male prostitutes and pedophiles. And then Paul now potentially parallel adultery with the word arsenokoitai. So here is what we believe at SpiritSong Church based on sound hermeneutics. Remember those rules of interpretation, a scholarly translation of 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for adulterers, for those practicing male prostitution or pedophilia, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound. We believe that that's a better rendering of the word arsenokoitai based on what Paul would witnessed, based on great articles and books like Robin Scrogg as an example. We believe that this is a sound hermeneutic translation. Now, what about 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 10? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because it has the same problems. Here's the actual clobber passage. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. That men who have sex with men, that original word, most scholars agree, is arsenokoitai. There are some people who claim the word was malakoi, but it's the same issue. Arsenokoitai and the word malakoi are lost in translation. You really have to go way back to more ancient renderings to have a better understanding. And so based on all that, we believe a scholarly translation of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 is, or you do not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who pay for sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. That is our review of 1 Timothy 1 and 1 Corinthians and our scholarly translations based on sound